Hey, Tony here. I know you probably didn't recognize me in this disguise. I'm thinking about auditioning for a role in a play and I'm trying to get into character, you know. I can only keep this up for a short time. Sometimes it's fun to pretend to be someone other than, who you are. But I'm much more comfortable just being myself. However, did you know that there were people in the early 20th century who concealed significant parts of their identities? It all had to do with the color line we read about. Social norms kept the races on opposite sides of the color line, and we've seen how freedoms and opportunities were not equally distributed. So many African Americans with light skin chose to live on the white side of the color line. This phenomenon was known as passing, and we'll encounter it in the works of Fauset and Larsen. In today's video, we'll be introduced to authors Jessie Redmond Fauset and Nella Larsen, and then we'll revisit Modernism and explore its connection to the Harlem Renaissance. We'll wrap up today's video with a rundown of your lesson agenda. All right, time travelers, let's take one more trip to the Harlem Renaissance. As we travel back to the 1920s, it's important to remember that segregation had a profound impact on people's lives. People of color were limited in where they could go, what they could do, and what they could achieve. Keep that in mind as we discuss two important Harlem Renaissance authors. Let's begin with Jessie Redmond Fauset. Jessie Redmond Fauset was born in New Jersey in 1882. A brilliant student, she was valedictorian of her high school and then went on to obtain a degree in classical languages from Cornell University, where she was one of the few African American students. And later, she went on to receive a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Fauset was teaching French in an all-black school in Washington, D.C. when W.E.B. Du Bois convinced her to move to New York and take on the role of literary editor of The Crisis. You remember, that was the official magazine of the NAACP, which Du Bois had co-founded. As literary editor of The Crisis, Fauset was tasked with discovering and nurturing the talents of authors like Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, and Jean Toomer. In this role, she helped direct the course of African American literature in the early 20th century. But Fauset was also an author in her own right. She published 4 significant novels between 1924 and 1933, and you'll be reading excerpts from 2 of them this week. Comedy, American Style, published in 1933, is not actually a comedy. In this story, the African-American protagonist thinks that she and her children will be better off if they pass for white. But think about it. What would be required of you if you changed your racial identity, especially in a segregated society? No more hanging out with the cousins, and no more holidays with the grandparents. You'd have to sacrifice your own cultural heritage and your community and let go of your social and familial bonds. In some ways, passing would make life easier because you'd be on the all-access side of the color line. But in other ways, it would be devastating. Fauset's 1928 novel, Plum Bun, also deals with passing. In this novel, the protagonist, a young artist of mixed race, leaves her community behind, moves to New York, and takes advantage of the opportunities presented when she passes as white. But there's a downside too, and Fauset is candid in showing readers that this choice is bittersweet. This week, you'll be introduced to another author who writes about similar themes, and her name is Nella Larsen. Nella Larsen was born Nellie Walker in Chicago, Illinois in 1891. Her mother was Danish and white, and her father was from the Danish West Indies and was black. This was significant because Larsen's biracial identity profoundly influenced her literary themes. Larsen's father died when she was only 2 years old, and she ended up being raised by her mother and Danish stepfather in a predominantly white neighborhood. She had little or no contact with her biological father's family, so she missed out on exploring that side of her cultural identity. Her early life was marked by feelings of isolation and alienation. Think about it. Being a biracial child in a white family might not seem that significant to us now, but at a time when segregation was in full swing, well, it couldn't have been easy for Larsen. Larsen worked as a nurse and then as a librarian before settling into Harlem's literary scene. But once her work emerged, people began to realize that her voice and perspective were unique and that her work had much to offer. Unfortunately, Larsen published only 2 novels before fading from public life: Quicksand in 1928 and Passing in 1929. This week, you'll be reading an excerpt from Passing, the novel that cemented Larsen's legacy. Once again, you'll encounter this idea of leaving one's race behind to pass for another. Passing features 2 longtime friends, Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield, and both of them can pass as being white, but it's Claire who has chosen to fully commit herself to that side of the color line. When the book opens, Irene receives a letter from Claire, and she realizes that Claire is nearby. As the novel continues, the friends reunite, and Irene experiments with passing. Larsen amplifies both the external and internal conflicts inherent in the practice of passing. You won't read the whole story, but as you read the first chapter, I want you to pay particular attention to the differences between these 2 characters. I suspect that they represent facets of Larsen's own personality and experience, and that they give us insight into what it must be like to hide or disguise a part of yourself so that you can take advantages of freedoms and opportunities you wouldn't otherwise be able to enjoy. There's something else I want you to pay attention to this week, and that's modernism. I know that was our last unit, but hear me out. We studied modernism as a separate movement, but it's important to realize that modernism and the Harlem Renaissance were going on at the same time. These people all dealt with World War I and its aftermath, with industrialism and economic disparity, with Jim Crow laws and racial violence, with cynicism and political upheaval. So it makes sense that although we look at the Harlem Renaissance as a very distinct cultural movement, we can still recognize characteristics of modernism in many Harlem Renaissance works. Let's review those characteristics now. We'll start with experimental techniques. Remember how T.S. Eliot took us inside the mind of J. Alfred Prufrock with all that stream of consciousness? Or how William Faulkner told the story of Thomas Sutpen from the perspective of several different characters, and how Faulkner experimented with nonlinear timelines? Modernists also used fragmentation. Sometimes poetry appeared fragmented by enjambment, those line breaks that interrupt the flow of language. Or sometimes conflicting images were juxtaposed, or lines were interrupted. And then there's subjectivity, where authors examine characters' emotional and psychological states and help us realize that our perceptions are largely based on our experiences. Think about Hemingway's Soldier's Home, where Krebs' wartime experience alters his perceptions so that he sees things differently from his parents and his sister. Finally, there's disillusionment. From Millet's Spring to Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, we find cynicism, pessimism, loneliness, and despair. As you read the works of Fauset and Larsen this week, watch for evidence of experimental techniques, fragmentation, subjectivity, and disillusionment. let's review the lesson agenda for this week. On days 1 through 4, you'll have PDF readings and activities, followed by online practice. On day 5, you'll answer reflection questions, refresh your writing skills, and take an online assessment. Oh, and this week's writing assignment will be a narrative vignette. What's a narrative vignette? Well, a narrative vignette is what's often called a slice of life. There's no plot development. It's more of a tightly focused descriptive piece. Your narrative vignette will be between 250 and 350 words in length, and it will focus on a character who is experiencing conflicts associated with societal norms. It can be set in the present, the past, or even the future. That's up to you. But as you write about a scene from this character's life, you'll need to include really detailed descriptions and at least 2 of the 4 characteristics of modernism. You know, the deeper we travel into literature, the more we realize that it allows us to see the world from a point of view that we may never actually experience. Seeing the world through someone else's eyes broadens our perspective and builds empathy. And that's something you're about to experience with Fauset and Larsen. Enjoy your reading and your writing this week. And most of all, enjoy being you.
Hey!